runoff into the lake, and then the lake exports that. And you can measure how much phosphorus leaves each subwatershed by measuring the water quality of the outlet stream and knowing how much water comes out. And when you do that, you can quantify it. And so Lake B exports 50 kilograms of phosphorus a year, and Lake A, because it's a bigger watershed, exports 100 kilograms of phosphorus. So if you were to look at that on its face, you'd say, well, Lake A is more important to protect than Lake B, because if Lake A declines, it's going to export twice as much phosphorus to our lake. But that's not always the case for this reason. Some lakes outlet to another lake, which then outlets to another lake, which then eventually reaches your lake of interest. And if that's the case, each time, when the water with 100 kilograms of phosphorus leaves this lake and then enters this one, some of that phosphorus drops out into the bottom sediments of that lake. So by the time it leaves there, you don't have 100 kilograms left, you have less. And then it does it again. So in this hypothetical example, Lake B exports 50 kilograms of phosphorus to our lake of interest, and Lake A also does, because it has these intermediate lakes between it. Well, okay, that's the hypothetical case, but what about the real example? So here we go. This is now looking at Sebago Lake. So here's Sebago Lake down here, and I'm just going to talk about two ponds, one lake and one pond, that both export water to Sebago Lake. One is called Highland Pond. I will tell you that before this project started, I never heard of it. I wouldn't have known it if it bumped into me, but there it is. It's way up there, but it is connected to Sebago Lake. It's very small. You can barely see it. It's that little round dark circle up there, blown up there. Another lake that we also evaluated is right here, and that's called Highland Lake. I know Highland Lake. I've swam in Highland Lake. It's a very large lake. It's popular. It's in Bridgeton. There's a lot of valuable homes around it. Anyway, it's also quite a bit closer to Sebago Lake. It's much larger and it's much closer. So if you had asked me before this project started, which is more important to the overall water quality of Sebago Lake, Highland Pond or Highland Lake, I would have said Highland Lake is far more important to protect. Turns out that that's not exactly the case. So the reason is this. So Highland Pond is way up there. Highland Lake is way down here, and there's Sebago Lake down there. Highland Pond exports, or it outlets directly into the Crooked River. So once that water leaves that pond and goes into the Crooked River, there's very little attenuation now. In other words, however much phosphorus leaves Highland Pond travels all the way down and enters Sebago Lake. Highland Lake, on the other hand, outlets to, it's more dramatic when the slides work. But anyway, it outlets from Highland Lake to Long Lake, which then outlets to Brandy Pond, which ultimately outlets to Sebago Lake. And as a result, we learned from this sensitivity analysis that Highland Pond generates, keep going, I think, okay, 82.5 kilograms of phosphorus outlet from that pond in a year. All of that reaches Sebago Lake. Highland Lake generates more than twice that much phosphorus, but only 77 kilograms actually makes its way all the way to Sebago Lake. So it turns out that if Highland Pond declined in quality, that Sebago Lake is more sensitive to that change than Highland Lake is.
So the 205 from Highland Lake that results in 77, is that 77 of the 205 or 77 including whatever is left from Highland Lake and whatever came into Long Lake and whatever?
Very good point. It's of the 205, only 77 of that makes it. But as you point out, Long Lake has its own subwatershed, so it generates some phosphorus that gets added to that, as does Brandy Pond. So ultimately, this chain of lakes adds a lot more phosphorus to Sebago than Highland Pond does. It's just that the actual subwatershed itself is, yes, right. So anyway, that analysis, that's just showing you two examples, but that was done for all the chains of lakes in the watershed, so we could actually calculate how much would a decline in this particular subwatershed affect Sebago. So again, remember, this is like the big aha moment when I realized that that little pond could have a bigger effect on Sebago Lake than this lake does, which I never would have guessed in a million years. Another thing that we discovered from this sensitivity analysis is that if you take all the phosphorus that flows into Sebago Lake in a year, and again, phosphorus is so important because it's food for algae. That's what the algae need. The lake has everything algae needs to grow except it's short on phosphorus, and this is true of most lakes in Maine. So if the phosphorus goes up, you're going to have more algae. And it turns out that the direct watershed of Sebago Lake, which is the Crooked River and down and right along the shoreline, that part of the overall watershed, more than 2/3 of all the phosphorus that goes into the lake comes from the direct watershed, and all the rest of the subwatersheds combined add up to the other 33%. So, which I'll show you where that means on here. Okay, one more time. That yellow area, 67 to 68% of all the phosphorus that flows into Sebago Lake comes down, flows off that part of the land. All this area shown in kind of a light blue is the rest is the indirect watershed, and all of that combined only amounts to 33% of all the phosphorus coming into the lake. Okay, so now the last thing, so that was sort of the analysis that was done, was to try to identify for each subwatershed which ones are in the best condition and how sensitive is Sebago Lake to a decline in water quality in that subwatershed. But our goal is not just to produce a report that feels good and gets us access to 319 funds again, which it does, by the way. We accomplished that because we just got a 319 grant a few weeks ago. So it accomplished that goal. But we don't want it to just sit on a shelf and never be looked at again. So we want to take the information that we learned and do outreach to the public, the people who live, the residents of the watershed, so they can see what we learned and it can inspire them to work with us to help protect their lakes in their subwatersheds. So what we came up with is we're calling them fact sheets. So I'm going to sort of break one apart for you to show you what they consist of. And these are things we're going to produce and distribute. Okay, so a fact sheet, we produced one for each subwatershed for which we had enough information. We don't have full information for all of them, but they're a 4-page report. This is what the front page looks like. The next page, which is where all that analysis is summarized. The next page describes what recommendations we would make. And then the last page details what the subwatershed is that we've evaluated for them and where it is relative to Sebago. So what these are is like a report card that tells you for this subwatershed, here's how you're doing. Here's what condition you're in. It's custom, it's detailed, it's full of facts for them. We tried to make it very easy to understand. And our goal is to generate discussion, because I will tell you, if you think about it, if you have kids, your daughter brings home a report card and there's a C in math. You have one of two reactions. You either say, honey, I knew you should have worked harder. Let's work together and do better. Or you say, who is that teacher? I'm going to go talk to him or her because my kid is way better than a C in math. But either way, it gets your attention and it focuses you. So even if we meet with residents of this subwatershed and they think our report doesn't reflect conditions as they understand them, what a great way to start our discussion. Now, obviously, we don't want to start an argument, but we would just say, look, we just use the data that's available to us. Let's talk about it. So our feeling is by putting them in this kind of report form, we'll get everybody's attention and we can generate some discussion, which hopefully will lead to either, wow, your subwatershed looks great, how can we keep it that way? Or your subwatershed seems to have some low scores, let's see if we can understand why. So we produced 22 of these. Of the 34 subwatersheds, there were 22 that had enough information. And
In your watershed, like Peabody Pond, can part of the lake, be accelerating or maintaining its
trophic state.
yeah. Other little pockets around.
If you had a lake that was it had a lot of embayments and you could have separate circulation kind of within. I mean, Sebago Lake has 3 bays. They tend to be slightly different, but kind of they turn over each year, and so once they do, it kind of mixes everything, and you have one water quality. There can be a period of time in the year where it's stratified, where Lower Bay looks better than Jordan Bay and Big Bay, but once the whole lake turns over, you kind of have one soup. So I don't think that really. It's kind of one report card for the lake. So I think this is just to show that there's a bunch of them. So this is just that there's one for each lake, and so now I'm going to just pick one and I'm going to break it into pieces and show you the anatomy of the fact sheet. So the one I chose is Peabody Pond, which is that lake just very close to Sebago. I'm just going to show you what the fact sheet looks like. So here it is. So there's a picture, a photograph of Peabody Pond. There's a narrative description that describes it that hopefully people who live around it will recognize it. There's a paragraph down here which is kind of boilerplate that just says the Portland Water District is interested in this because it's part of the larger Sebago Lake system. Because if you live around Peabody Pond, your primary issue is Peabody Pond. Sebago is of secondary concern to you. So we're just explaining here why we care, that ultimately your lake drains to Sebago. This is kind of the nuts and bolts of the whole thing. And we used a Secchi disc as a symbol or as the graphic to kind of give them their 4 scores. So the 4 scores are current lake conditions are there, and then the trend in lake water quality is there, and then the land use trend is there, and then how many partnerships we could identify, and then you get an overall score. So in each of those 4 scores, you can get a maximum of 5. So a lake that was very clear, was trending, improving, had very little land use change, and had lots of partners would get a 20. And anything lower than that means, well, you're not getting a top score in every category. But it breaks it down for them so they can kind of see what is it that seems to be lacking or where is it that we see concerns. The next page is a list of recommendations. But the key thing about this is that often, I mean, if you live around a lake and you get a brochure that has recommendations in it, they're very boilerplate. Don't cut down all the shrubs and trees in the buffer. You know, there's a bunch of standard things, but what Cumberland County did, and they put a lot of work into this, is they wrote recommendations that were specific to the score that lake got for that, you know, in that sub-watershed. So they're not just boilerplate. They don't all read the same. They're sort of saying, based on what we see, this is what we recommend. So those recommendations are custom. And then the last page shows the location of the sub-watershed relative to the larger Sebago Lake watershed, and then it shows more detail so that they can understand what we mean by your sub-watershed. So it shows some roads and some town boundaries and things, and then the outline of the sub-watershed so they can know what area we're talking about. And it gives a definition of watershed. So the idea is that we could go to a planning board meeting or a town council meeting or a lake association meeting and bring copies of this and pass them out, and then everyone can go home and read more detail about what we learned about their lake and sub-watershed. Okay, so that's essentially what we did. Some of the things that I feel like sort of take-home messages, things we learned about the Sebago Lake watershed that we didn't necessarily know before, is that almost all the sub-watersheds that we could evaluate, 19 of 23, show a stable or even an improving trophic state. So that's really good news. If that was the reverse, it would sort of mean you just wait. 5 or 10 years from now, you're really going to see a difference in Sebago Lake. But it doesn't seem like we have poor water and declining water quality coming our way. 68% of the phosphorus that reaches Sebago Lake comes from just the direct watershed. So you might, if you've been on the board for a while, you've heard the term Crooked River quite a lot. And we've been doing a lot of work around the Crooked River. Well, that runs right down the center of the direct watershed. And so we are putting the effort where most of the phosphorus comes from. And of all the sub-watersheds, again, they were ranked in 4 different ways. Only 6 of them were low in 2 or more of the metrics. None was low in 3, but only 6 were low in 2 of the metrics. So ones that had a low score, they had 1 low score and not more than that. So that's another good sign. There were no basket cases, I guess, is what we found. So there's many ways that we can slice and dice this information to use it, but this is just showing you, for example, here's the watershed. There's some how'd that happen? It's not very, it's a little hair trigger. So anyway, this is just showing you, for example, this was showing you which of the sub-watersheds had low in existing water quality or trending water quality. These are the sub-watersheds that showed the most land use change over a 25-year period. This shows you which ones we can't identify any lake partners. So, I mean, so something we might do is, well, let's go out there and see if we can figure out what lake associations exist out there or who's active. And then this last one, this might be the sub-watersheds we want to address first. These are the ones that were low in 2 metrics. So 2 different measures of sub-watershed health. These sub-watersheds were low in 2. So not a bad idea to say, well, let's see if we can get active in those. This is just my take-home about the project itself. First of all, the data already existed. You know, oftentimes the obstacle to doing an analysis of something is you don't have the data. It turns out all this data existed. We did do some field work, but that was kind of to ground truth some of the data that already existed to make sure we could believe it. I've been on a lot of teams over 25 years. Often I feel like, when the team process ends, that I was just filling the Portland Water District seat. Like they wanted a partner from the Portland Water District. They didn't really need me for anything. I was just there so that they could check that off. Yep, we had the Water District here. This project was very different because everybody that was on the team contributed in some substantial way that the project wouldn't have been as good without them. And that isn't always the case. So it felt really good at the end of it that, wow, in every meeting, everyone went home with homework and then came back with it done. And that doesn't always happen either. So I was really happy with the way the project went. I was also happy that we spent a lot of time, in fact, 2 whole meetings, arguing about what the fact sheet should look like. Is that language clear? I remember there was one meeting, Kirsten's smiling over there because we argued about one word for like 20 minutes, and at the end Kirsten said, I think I liked the first word better, and we went back and left it the way it was. But you have to you want to form a partnership, you got to let everybody speak, and you have to seriously consider what they say. So it was a sort of, I wouldn't say it was tedious. It was a challenging process, but in the end, everybody walked away feeling like they had a say in what the results were. And as I said, when I got over my week of cynicism of saying, let's just do this thing and get it done so we can get back to doing erosion control work, we really did produce something that has information in it that we can use for many years to sort of prioritize work that we do. So it accomplished that goal, as well as I say, it satisfied the requirement that EPA and DEP had, and now we are eligible to apply for and receive 319 monies, which we wouldn't have if we didn't complete this project. And that's it. And again, that's our Cumberland County partners' email addresses on there. But
Are the sub-watershed reports, are they online so that?
not in a way that we haven't, we just finished this like a month and a half ago, so we haven't really done the rollout yet. We're kind of thinking after everyone's kind of, Cumberland County especially, I got to tell you, they've been excellent partners with us on a lot of projects, but this was one of the most impressive that I've seen, because they had to pull all this together, and there was a strict deadline that DEP gave them, and so they're kind of like catching their breath right now. But our intention is, after the first of the year, we're going to get together and talk about, for example, there may be some subwatersheds. We've done a lot of 319 projects, but for most of them, Cumberland County takes the lead. They are either the grant recipient, or we receive the grant, but then we subcontract it so they administer it. So they're really kind of the point person for a lot of these projects. So once they catch their breath, we're planning to meet and say, okay, so we have all this information. All the fact sheets are done, but they're not like, they're online, but you'd have to know how to get there. But our intention is to either make them available online and or go to individual towns and pass them out so that people can interact with them.
There's an area in the far northwest of almost every slide that you showed. I'm assuming that's Bethel. That was bad in pretty much everything.
Yeah. Go forward again. I think you could see it on these, like that one up there.
Yeah.
So it's got, that pond apparently is not the highest of water quality.
But
I think it might be low in
that
two.
shows up as
Yeah, there it is, low in
issue
partnership. So it's very remote. We don't know anybody up there. It doesn't mean that there's nobody living there, but I do think there's. Yeah,
Is that Bethel?
is that Bethel? If it is, it's not like downtown Bethel. It's out in the middle of the woods. But we've never worked up there, honestly. Is that Songo Pond? Is that what that is? It looks big for Songo Pond. I'm not sure what pond that is.
So that, continue on that, to what degree were people skeptical about what you were doing, that this was gonna lead to enforcement by the DEP on these lakes?
Well, we haven't engaged the public with the results yet. All the partners were at the table, but that was DEP, Lakes Environmental Association, University of Southern Maine, PWD, and Cumberland County Soil and Water. So we haven't done any outreach with it yet. That's not the intention of it, but I see what,
It's gonna improve if people cut
I will be honest with you and tell you that within the 7 towns that ring the lake, we have a fairly good handle on the degree to which they're enforcing shoreland zoning, because we go with them on inspections, and anytime there's work in the shoreland zone of Sebago Lake, we know about it and we go there with them. We have no enforcement authority, but sometimes they have us help them. They'll say, write us a letter saying you're unhappy with this, because you can be the bad cop to our good cop. So we have quite a good handle on it, but just, I'll be honest and say, you go up 5, 10, 15, 20 miles, we're not heavily involved in what is going on up there. We're getting more and more, as each year goes by, we're meeting more and more of the code officers up the Crooked River. And generally, we're not viewed as the enemy, but we don't have any enforcement authority either. So we kind of go as with a technical assistance mode. We've offered grant money up the Crooked River, didn't get a lot of takers on it, but so we're kind of treading lightly, because we don't want to be, essentially our message here is, this is your lake and your subwatershed, this is your town. We care because it comes to Sebago Lake, but you ought to care because it's, your property values are based on that. So there's certainly the potential for somebody saying get lost, but our intention is to provide information kind of in a non-threatening way. And for the most part, you're talking motherhood and apple pie generally when you're talking about clean lakes. Like, nobody's really against that. How you get to that, sometimes there's disagreement. But we tend not to prescribe how to get to that. We simply say, this is what we see.
We have a situation where I have a client in the middle of Durham, Maine, runaround pond, the DEP's going, because of the code enforcement, made a phone call, DEP's there, and because they cut 50 square feet of trees, that's a half a mile from the pond. It just seems like they'll be a step. That will probably have to be a step.
Our goal is just to inspire lakes and subwatershed who want to do erosion control work, partner with Cumberland County and/or us and others, and we'll work on it together. Really, we haven't really done anything enforcement-wise north of the 7 towns. We have no authority, so we're really trying to encourage people to see how their property values are related to the water quality of their lakes. And we don't hide the fact that the reason we care so much is your lake eventually outlets to Sebago. But I will tell you, I've given a couple presentations in the upper watershed, and there's a little bit of you're a flatlander from Portland, why are you here? There's an element of that, but generally, when you show them what information you're providing, it doesn't really have an editorial comment associated with it. It's just, this is what we have seen. And I've never been kind of run out of town. I felt funny coming in, but they warm up after a while, because the district doesn't go in prescribing much. We just kind of offer. I think our policy is wear clothing appropriate to the setting. So I generally wear like a flannel shirt and cargo pants. So.
Any other questions? So this is very recent.
Yes, I think late September is when it ended. So it's just been a month and a half or so.
Great.
Appreciate your attention. Thanks.